Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for today's presentation. I'm very excited to have worked on this with some esteemed colleagues. And if we can go to the next slide, I'll introduce you to the first one.
All right, we're just having a moment of technical difficulties. If we can just wait for 1 second.
So I think while we're sorting out the slides, I can actually start with the introduction. I wanted to introduce you to my colleague, Liz Zale. Liz, would you mind introducing yourself to our attendees?
Absolutely. Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everyone. I am a managing director and partner from the firm of Sard Verbinnen. We're a strategic communications firm. And we focus on a lot of high profile issues and situations, have a lot of expertise in the education sector, and really pleased to be here today.
Thanks very much, Liz. And everyone, my name is Sarah Luke. I'm an attorney in the higher education practice in the New York City office of Bond, and have worked with Liz and a lot of my colleagues at Bond to prepare this presentation. I think we're still working on the slides, but in the meantime, I can give you an overview of what we're going to cover. So as you might imagine, we here at Bond and Liz as well, we think that there are significant advantages to a preparedness approach to crises as opposed to being reactive. And through this presentation, we intend to provide a framework for such an approach to ensure that our institutional responses to crises reflect both our organizational values and our institutional missions. We all know it's really easy to slip into a ready, fire, aim approach when tensions are high, when pressures are high, when all eyes are on us. But we all know that it's best to approach crises in a position where you're informed, where you're working collaboratively with key stakeholders, and in a way that is well reasoned. So through this presentation, we're going to discuss how to form a crisis management team. What is that? What the role of such a team will be, and how attorneys might play a role, how your internal stakeholders might play a role, and what role a PR firm or a crisis management firm could play in that process. We're going to talk about how to manage communications during a crisis. And we're going to focus on special considerations for key stakeholders. After we've gone through those sort of basics, we're going to work through some real life scenarios, some not so hypotheticals, and put those principles into practice. So I think we're still working on the visuals, but in the meantime, we're going to just charge right ahead because I got Liz here, and between her and I, we're going to talk a little bit about what it means to form a crisis management team. So in my experience, and from working with other colleagues at Bond, I think one of the most important things to do is to consider who are your key stakeholders? You know, who do you think needs to be on that team? And with higher education institutions, the stakeholders come from all different sectors, right? So we have students, we have faculty, we have town gown issues, so the community in which you reside. You have alumni and donors to the institution. Some of you have organized labor. Institutions of higher learning can be very decentralized. It's kind of a hallmark of the academy. It's what makes us special. So it's really important. There we are. Yeah, so this is Liz Zale, whom you have met. If we can go to the next slide, that's me, who you've been hearing from. Preparedness versus reaction, we kind of went through that. And then the next slide, we are up to speed. Perfect. Thank you, Kathy. That is how we handle crises at Bond. We work together and we work through them. Within the context of who are your stakeholders and who might be on your team, the role of counsel is important to consider. One issue that we see come up quite frequently is people sometimes have a misunderstanding about the scope of the attorney-client privilege. So just because you have an attorney serving on your team, coming to meetings or copied on correspondence, doesn't necessarily make that correspondence or the subject of that meeting covered by the attorney-client privilege. The scope of the privilege is limited to confidential communications that convey legal advice or seek legal advice. So that's important to consider. Now I'd like to turn it over to Liz to talk a little bit about what a crisis management or PR firm does and how they might play a role in your team.
Thanks, Sarah. So I would say there are a number of roles that a firm like mine and others can play in a crisis situation, and also in terms of preparedness. A lot of the work that we do actually with education clients is working on those preparedness plans, which we'll get into a little bit more in a minute, but really helping to think through scenarios and give you sort of your best shot at having done that work in advance to try to anticipate and also accelerate your response. But I think also a lot of the role that we can help play along with counsel is to really give you some perspective on how other organizations and institutions have gone through these crises, have addressed these issues, some of the pitfalls. We can really help you see around corners. We can also help specifically as a crisis management and PR firm, we can help with relationships that we have with top tier media, which you might not normally be used to engaging with, and which sort of puts a lot more sort of pressure and spotlight on the situation. So those are just a few of the ways.
Thank you, Liz. Now, if we go to the next slide, and Liz kind of mentioned this, so you're going to come up with a plan. And a big part of that plan will be the formation of a team. So you've identified your stakeholders, you've worked with Liz or a company like Liz's to help. They can actually help you think of stakeholders who might not necessarily come to mind on your own. Different situations could require different stakeholders to serve on your team. So when we walk through the scenarios, you'll learn about a number of different types of crises, and they might require different people to be around the table. Diversity of thought is important to make sure that you have represented on your team. And my colleague Candice Gomez is going to touch on that and sort of why that's important. And you're going to want to be able to facilitate a thoughtful and efficient response. There are certain constituents that I just want to flag for you. The ones that I think are very important to communicate with proactively are your governing board members. So if you have an orientation for board members, first of all, if you don't, I would suggest that you develop one. But this is something really to foreshadow in that kind of orientation, because trustees, board members usually are very interested in the health and well-being of the institution. They want to help. They have fiduciary obligations, but it's important for us to provide them with a framework in which to do so that really matches our crisis management plan. For public institutions, you're also going to pay special attention to state sunshine laws. So correspondence within the institution, within the governing body, and within the crisis management team could be subject to FOIL. And also meetings among and between trustees could be subject to open meetings laws. Liz, did you have any additional information you'd like to contribute here?
Sure. I think just in terms of kind of thinking about timelines, it's important to have some sense of agreement about sort of the level of urgency that certain kinds of situations dictate. And a lot of what we do with a plan is really actually look at a series of the most likely and or most concerning scenarios that we feel we need to to both do the work ahead of time to really think through. And that can mean even going all the way to creating communications templates for some of the stakeholders that Sarah mentioned, just so you have that starting point. As I said before, it can really accelerate your response time, but even having sort of the expectations around what it means to have certain situations sort of happening, what you might need to either report or disclose with certain kinds of scenarios. And I think being mindful of time, because what happens in a crisis situation is time goes faster than you ever thought possible. And yet it never feels like your response is fast enough to many of your stakeholders. And so you're constantly navigating that very challenging dynamic. And to the extent that you can sort of give yourself that robust starting point, it can really be helpful in both preparing for and navigating a crisis successfully.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Liz. So another important consideration for crises is the management of communication. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Phil Zacchio, to take the lead on this important issue.
So thanks, Sarah. And Kathy, you can give us the next slide, please. So in talking about putting together our team and this issue of, okay, how do they function and do we respond? We talk about managing communications. The threshold question is, in any particular circumstance, are we going to respond to what is out there? And you might think that on a communications team, there might be some inherent tensions. For example, an assumption that the lawyers never want to say anything, or that the communications folks always want to respond to everything that's out there. And I would just say, in my experience, that is not a universal phenomenon, and the best teams can work together to achieve their institutional goals while also doing what's right on both the legal front, but also the optical and PR front as well. So to be sure, yes, there are some legal constraints on disclosure in particular circumstances. The most obvious one, for example, if you are talking about student issues, is FERPA. And oftentimes you will have a student or multiple students out there criticizing the institution, maybe even making statements about what they experienced, what did or didn't happen to them in a given situation. And there may be an assumption that, well, if the student is disclosing their own information, we can do whatever we want to correct the record because they're making misrepresentations or casting us in an inaccurate light. And unfortunately, under FERPA, the equation is not that simple. Merely because a student is talking to a media outlet does not mean that we have, at that point, carte blanche to say whatever we want about the student. There are some parameters there. Similarly, in a litigation context, if what we're talking about is litigation that's been filed against the institution or threatened against the institution, there may be concerns about what we say and whether what we say can somehow expose the institution further. Is it some kind of an admission? Is it some kind of a statement that comes back to haunt us? My message is that these things can all be managed, right? So we can be sure that what we are saying, if we respond, is within the bounds of FERPA. We can be sure that what we are saying doesn't put us in a bad place from a liability management standpoint. We'll talk a little bit in a couple of minutes here in terms of how that can be challenging sometimes when you have multiple voices or multiple contexts in which we are speaking and making sure we stay on message. But the bottom line is these things are manageable and they can be dealt with accordingly. I think the lawyers in the room need to resist the temptation sometimes to think that the legal is always the paramount, right? And I think there is, in some situations, a temptation to say, okay, if the lawyer says we can't talk, we can't talk. And I think those of us who are counsel have to be mindful of the fact that, yeah, we don't want to walk into a liability trap, certainly, but in many cases, the reputational impact on an institution can eclipse several times over the liability impact on an institution in a particular circumstance, both in terms of likelihood of it coming to fruition and also magnitude. And it's worth us as counsel keeping that in mind as we work as part of a team to engage and to do what's necessary to protect the institution, both, yes, legally, but also reputationally. Does this mean we run around violating the law and saying whatever we want to? No, of course it doesn't. But one of the, the open secrets here is there are plenty of ways to respond while staying on the correct side of the line. There are plenty of ways to say something without saying too much. So, for example, if we've got a student saying that they don't know why they were expelled from the institution and they were the victim of some kind of a star chamber process, we may respond by saying, look, we believe this criticism is unfounded. We can't speak about details of a particular case, but what we can tell you about is our process, and here's how it works. And in every process, every student gets a detailed description of what they are accused of having done wrong, and they have a full opportunity to have their side of the story heard and considered in making a decision. And I can assure you that happens in every case on our campus. And in doing so, you've rebutted and answered the criticism without speaking directly to the case. So again, there are ways to navigate all of this from the legal standpoint. Liz, how about the optical and strategic considerations in a circumstance like this?
I think there's a dynamic sort of tension and need to consider sort of both of those aspects, which sometimes can conflict, honestly. Strategic considerations could very much be about litigation or other kind of implications from that standpoint, whereas optical, I would say, is very much about reputation, about relationships, about the goals that you're trying to achieve. And so those really dictate that this is a series of judgments that need to be made. And it's one of the reasons why a firm like mine works very closely with your outside counsel, because we really do need to kind of think through how all of these things potentially intersect, or where is that path that we can kind of create that's addressing sort of all of these considerations. One thing that you really want to think about is, am I, by taking a particular action, am I feeding the fire? Am I turning this into something bigger, and perhaps unnecessarily creating more visibility and awareness around an issue, versus, again, with the fire analogy, kind of starving it of oxygen, really not responding, not necessarily making it kind of a more visible situation, but sort of addressing specific constituencies or stakeholders that are involved and trying to really contain it. Again, kind of goes to what Phil was saying earlier. This is very situation dependent. And so how you think about what those actions are can vary dramatically based on sort of where you are in the crisis, and also what the sort of fact pattern is, what information you have, et cetera. And I'll talk about that in a minute, but first there's this idea also that you really have to address about whether someone, is in a position of needing to know versus feeling like they have the right to know and have sort of full information. There's a lot of discussion about transparency and about making information available, and that is a value that many institutions hold dear. However, as Phil mentioned, there are also potentially legal considerations, regulatory constraints around that. And so there you often find yourselves, particularly with students, in situations where their desire for transparency and to have full information and full awareness about a situation, how you addressed it, what were the outcomes, what was your reasoning and rationale, in part because people want to be part of that judgment. And unfortunately, it can be very unsatisfying to that sort of right to know constituency when, the institution has to be in a position of saying, actually, it's very important that we protect the privacy of those involved. And you have to be very explicit and use terms like privacy, talk about policies as Phil did. And that's really, in our view, one of the ways that you can do your best to kind of navigate that, because there's rarely a need for or kind of a demand for full disclosure. We don't put a press release out with every single thing that happens. In fact, we hope that many things don't see the light light of day because they happen, we address them appropriately, and we all move on. It's also, we don't want to bring attention to issues where it could be unhelpful, again, because people will take something out of context, will not have the full story, will not be able to access that information, et cetera. So those are all the considerations. And then last but not least, we do think about this issue. Do we know enough to know what we don't know? There are so many times in a crisis where you have limited information. You really have to be extremely careful about what you say, and also kind of the path that you lay out in terms of keeping people informed. It's a common message point to say, we'll keep you updated as the situation evolves, but realistically, sometimes that's valid, and sometimes you're not actually going to keep people updated. You're going to have to sort of try to, again, sort of starve the situation of oxygen. So you want to be really thoughtful. It depends in part on the situation. This is, again, where kind of the judgment and experience that that those of us who unfortunately have seen so many of these situations and kind of the variables and what can play out, and can anticipate some of those sort of future developments, can really help you navigate that situation. So I think going to the next slide, there's also aspects about sort of who and how really are participating in the communications. It's critical to think about many aspects of this. Who would your institutional spokespeople be, person or people, depending on the situation? Is it someone internal or external? Does that vary depending on the stakeholder? Do you have me talk to the media, whereas you have the dean of the college speak to, students and faculty and staff? Who speaks to alumni? Where you think also about the factor of kind of internal involvement. As we know, in institutions, many issues immediately are sort of operating under the assumption, or students or others are operating under the assumption the president has to become involved, or the head of the institution has to be involved in this because it's important to me, and it needs to be part of, they need to be part of addressing this issue. But realistically, sometimes it's very important to make sure that you're really sort of focusing that spokesperson or the sort of involvement of the institution at an appropriate level. If it's something in the athletics department, it's probably the AD who's going to be a spokesperson or be the kind of voice of here's what's happening, here's what we're doing, et cetera. Thinking about kind of the in issues where president is involved, it may be the board of trustees who need to sort of be that spokesperson, the chair of the board, et cetera. So I think really thinking about how you're not immediately escalating. There are times when you need to do that, but often it's really important to think about what that progression might be. If an issue escalates over time, it may rise to the level of the president or chancellor having to speak, but we don't want to default to that position, because again, you create sort of role confusion, you create voice confusion, you set an expectation and precedent that the president or chancellor will be involved in every issue, and that can be distracting and really counterproductive, especially again, when you might be seeking to starve something of oxygen and not sort of make it perceived as though this is sort of an institution defining moment. You need to recognize when it is, but you need to also recognize when it's not. I think one last point I would make on that is just that the idea of who are the priority audiences and sequencing, again, varies by situation. Of course, with an on-campus event, your immediate priority is that in-person, hopefully now, in-person campus community, the students, the faculty, the staff who are there, the administrators, and making sure that particularly with issues of safety, of course, that is your primary focus. Very quickly, though, parents need to, and families need to be brought into that, and sometimes simultaneously with students, depending again on what your sort of normal course communications are. The precedents that you've established on sort of an ongoing way really matter in also how you take action in a particular crisis. And then thinking about, yes, we do think it's important to address this with alumni, but do we have to address this day one? Maybe or maybe not. So again, thinking about there isn't a need or a requirement to respond to everyone with the same level of messaging on the same timing. In fact, it's almost impossible to do that. And Phil, I think, can speak to also the importance of consistency around that messaging.
Yeah, and consistency in these situations is critical. I mean, consistency essentially translates to credibility for an institution in many circumstances. And I think when things are moving as fast as they are, as Liz described it before, and when we are looking at sequencing for different audiences, maybe having different folks talking in two different audiences in different contexts, you do run the risk of getting off message. And again, there's no easier way to judge, to jeopardize institutional credibility than to be saying one thing to one audience, something different to another, to be promising a new update by a specified date and not coming through with it afterwards. Just critical to avoid those kinds of situations. And again, it can be a natural function of a lot of people doing things simultaneously, different audiences, also different forums, right? This is no longer a world in which an institution speaks through a media relations person to a single media outlet that they plan and that they may have a relationship with. And so you can control message and you don't have to worry about this. I mean, now anybody can be a journalist, or at least they think they can, right? And on any number of different platforms. And so we now have a situation in which you have literally thousands of conversations going on dozens of different social media platforms and elsewhere. And depending on who's going to respond, facing a challenge in terms of making sure we stay consistent, in terms of content, in terms of timing, all of that, again, highlighting the importance, Sarah mentioned at the outset, of being proactive and planning this, as opposed to reactive, where one person's running off and saying this and one person's running off and saying that. But again, social media in this area has been, I think all of us would agree, a game changer. And Liz, in my experience, that's where folks such as you can really contribute some amazing value just in terms of your expertise in dealing with that environment.
Sure, and just to speak really quickly to that, I think the point of having a presence on social is to have a conversation, and yet in a crisis, it becomes very difficult to have the kind of conversations that you want to have. You can very quickly lose control. So a couple of points that we've represented here, the correction of misstatements. Is that something that generally you should engage on or not? And I think realistically, providing in many cases, what you might need to do is provide a high-level post with the facts or sort of the outline of the situation and kind of what you're doing to address it. But it becomes very difficult very quickly to respond to every inaccuracy or sort of question or issue that comes up. You quickly go down a rabbit hole, and that's what we call, not maintaining message discipline, but also, you will never win a conversation on social media. And so I think making sure that it's really important to represent what you need to, because if there has been any other kind of communication, as Phil mentioned earlier, whether it's coming from the institution or media news coverage, the first place people will actually look, particularly if you sort of go to younger demographics, will be social media. So you need to really consider how you're going to show up. Think about that alignment of message across platforms as well. Doesn't mean you have to be as broad and deep and sort of detail oriented in each of the platforms. There are different things that you say on social, and obviously the medium really forces you to be much more brief, concise, and high level. But again, thinking about sort of that consistency and alignment is key. In terms of thinking about disabling interactive features, This is really something that we don't recommend in the vast majority of situations. Shutting off comments really only creates a whole other sort of negative reaction. There might be very specific circumstances when we would recommend that. So when you're running a paid ad campaign that people are having some kind of reaction to, or if there is a post that's highly sensitive to harassment or trolling, that might be a situation where you would seek to do that. But generally, we would say it's much better to leave your comments open, actively monitor for what comments are worth responding to, and being selective about that. Specific to another aspect of this, is it fair game to think about hiding posts? Really, Facebook is the only place you can kind of do that realistically. We'd say you can do that, particularly if if you've been clear about what your guidelines are. Even though it's Facebook's platform, you can still have sort of a clear representation of, we expect this to be a supportive, respectful community, et cetera, on your sort of on your Facebook homepage. And that's really important because you're setting the guardrails for how you expect people to operate. And then it gives you the freedom and flexibility to say, we're not going to tolerate hate speech, harassment, et cetera. So analytics really quickly really help you determine how you're going to respond. Looking at sort of the extent of followers that someone who made a post might have, looking at the level of engagement, looking at whether the conversation is happening in other places. Those are all very, very important factors that determine how and when you might engage. Those are all things that we would look at for a specific post or even in an issue. You'd really want to be looking at that. And the reality is responding often could give something more attention back to the sort of feeding the fire than it deserves. And you really don't also want to sort of give that impression that something is more important. So I won't say it's a clearly defined line. It's pretty difficult to determine. But again, situationally, you have to make those judgments and then you have to sort of adapt as you need to. There's no question that Twitter will always draw the most trolls and sort of random bot responses, et cetera. So there, it's largely something that you're probably just going to have to ignore a negative post or reaction unless it's becoming an ongoing pattern or gaining a lot of traction. But realistically, most students are likely to use Twitter or Instagram. So you have to keep that in mind in terms of what you want to proactively put out for information. And one other dynamic to think about is you need to consider whether you have to pause your regularly scheduled social media activity in a crisis. You will look like you are not considering the appropriate context, and to say happy cheery things about the spring fling coming up, or this great panel we just had when there is an invasion of Ukraine happening. So relevant example that we're seeing tons of. And so I think it's really important to think about that and to think about what policies you have in place to make sure you have clarity about who are the authorized spokespeople. The reality that if someone has a visible role in its institution, I'm a coach, I'm an assistant coach, I'm an administrator, I am likely being perceived as speaking for the institution. And so they need to be mindful of that. If you're going to make your social platforms publicly available and your posts publicly available to anyone, then you really have to consider and have, I think, an institutional set of policies and approaches around the implications of that. And we've even developed plans for people to really have a level of comfort, direction, and guidance about, okay, well, what is appropriate for me to post, given the role that I play in the institution. So I think that's plenty on social media for now.
Great. Well, thank you, Phil and Liz. I think that communications and social media is one of the hardest things to manage in a crisis. But if I had to pick two hardest things, the next hardest one would be tricky stakeholders. So I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Monica Barrett. You can go to the next slide. who's going to walk you through, she's going to work with Liz and walk you through how to handle some tricky stakeholders.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. And what Liz and I are going to do is talk about dealing with a public crisis when you have numerous stakeholders involved. And as a backdrop to our discussion, we will discuss the very public tragedy that resulted in the creation of the Tyler Clementi Center for Diversity, Education, and Bias Prevention at Rutgers. Now, I spent, before coming to Bond, I spent about 19 years at Rutgers as in-house counsel. And the Tyler Clementi suicide was it was an incident that was a major crisis on the campus. And the reason I can talk about it is that it was very public, in that there was a criminal case that resulted from the Tyler Clementi suicide. There was a huge article in the New Yorker magazine. There were articles in the New York Times almost daily for a while about the issue at Rutgers. So let me just tell you a little bit about it, and then Liz and I can talk about how we dealt with the crisis at the time, and it'll map a lot of what Liz and Phil and Sarah were just saying. So it's been almost 12 years since Tyler Clementi took his own life by jumping off the George Washington Bridge. This happened at the end of September 2010, when Tyler was only 3 weeks into his first semester as a freshman at Rutgers. His suicide occurred soon after he discovered that his roommate, Darun Ravi, had set up on his computer, he set up his computer as a live cam aimed at Tyler's bed. Now, Darun did this after Tyler had asked him if he could have privacy in the room for a few hours because he had invited his boyfriend over. Darun agreed to leave the room, but before he did so without Tyler knowing, he worked with other dorm mates who were also freshmen. He worked with them to aim the camera at Tyler's bed and to test it in from other people's computers. So Tyler found out about the fact that Darun had set this up because Darun had sent out an email invitation. It was a multiple email chat invitation to people in the dorm, and he didn't realize that Tyler was part of the chat. And he invited fellow dorm students to watch the video cam when Tyler had his boyfriend over into the room. Now, as it turned out, there was actually no widely broadcast incident involving Tyler and his friend. What was viewed by Darun and another dorm mate, and they viewed Tyler kissing his boyfriend, but then they shut the camera down. Now, what happened after that, Tyler that evening was when he jumped off the George Washington Bridge. There was an immediate public reaction to it. The Middlesex County prosecutor started to investigate what happened at Rutgers, if anything happened at Rutgers that caused the suicide. Excuse me. Subpoenas were issued on Rutgers, subpoenas for documents, subpoenas for witness testimony at the prosecutor's office. Staff members at Rutgers in residence life at Rutgers were called down to the Middlesex County detective's office and questioned. There was a data recovery warrant that was issued at Rutgers, on Rutgers, by the Middlesex County prosecutor's office, that the warrant was asking Rutgers to turn over all of the web information of all the computers in the particular dormitory that connected out to the external, outside of the dorm, so that the prosecutor's office was able to collect all kinds of data, all kinds of emails from the students, and if they were emailing, texting, or through using the university system with all their communications. And all of this information was used in the criminal case. So while this was going on, it was definitely crisis mode at Rutgers, obviously. And in terms of, Liz, I wanted to ask you, in terms of when you look at the list of stakeholders involved, especially the law enforcement, when you're in a situation of advising a campus in this type of situation, how do you handle public statements when you know law enforcement is serving subpoenas on the university and questioning witnesses?
Not to be glib, but carefully. I think you do have a lot of challenges that you're trying to sort of address appropriately. I think to the extent as you probably already have, a relationship with local law enforcement, I think relying on the police information officer, who is that spokesperson, and really sort of, this is where the benefit of that relationship sort of comes to the forefront, because they understand they can try to be helpful to you. I think it is very difficult for the institution to be the spokesperson about activity of law enforcement. So what you do need to think about is, what are the other things that I need to be communicating? How does that relate to this? I need to be, particularly mindful of not sort of crossing any lines or being perceived as sort of making a judgment or comment or interfering with the investigation in any way. So I think it's you really try to leverage that relationship and that role, and with an unfortunate and tragic situation such as Tyler Clementi's suicide, I think that there was a lot of that sort of need for law enforcement to kind of be commenting and providing press conferences and providing updates. And so I think it's really about making sure that you're kind of appropriately representing that aspect as sort of their territory.
Yeah, and in the particular situation, the Middlesex County prosecutor in New Jersey, it was an elected role. So he was a politician and he had just been elected. So this was, there were a lot of news stories. Everybody was talking about this incident. So he was particularly aggressive, but the best advice I got, as I was the liaison on the whole issue when I worked at Rutgers. Someone advised me it's best to go meet him in person and have a cup of coffee rather than phone. And I'm saying that, as we're coming out of the pandemic, face-to-face meetings with people that are your potential, I don't want to use the term adversary when you're talking about a criminal case, but if you have a position that you need to relay, and we were located right near the prosecutor's office. I went down and I talked to him, and there was a very cooperative interaction during that whole process. So I want to go to the next slide, and in terms of what we did at Rutgers, which again is very public. And I always thought this quote was Winston Churchill, but it's Albert Einstein who made that quote. But what we did at Rutgers right after Tyler's suicide was we reached out to the family. They were represented by counsel, of course, but we reached out through counsel. We had immediate face-to-face meetings with them. Again, face-to-face, we weren't writing letters. We contacted the attorney and said, we'd like to talk about what we can do. and I skipped over monitoring social media just because Liz and Phil got very deep into that. In terms of what we did when we met with the family was that we talked about what Rutgers could do to address the issue of bullying, LGBTQ bullying in particular, and what the family would be interested in if we were able to put on an academic conference. So we did, in fact, put on an academic conference where we invited speakers from across the country to come to Rutgers, and who their particular research was in bullying, especially in when students transfer into, or not transfer, but transition from high school into college. And there was a lot of education that needed to be done, we realized, about how residence life, the reach out to freshmen, it needed to happen sooner, and it needed to be, perhaps in the dorms where student groups such as the LGBTQ organization would come into the dorms and say, we're an organization you can join. Because what we found out during the criminal trial with all of the data that was turned over was that Tyler spent a lot of time on social media, alone in his room, talking to his friends who are at other colleges and universities about how he didn't know how to talk to his roommate. Darun was doing the same thing. They were literally both in the same room at the same time, emailing or text messaging friends of theirs to say things as one text I remember specifically was Darun had said, should I just get up and open the curtains, or should I ask him first if I can open the curtains? So it made me realize at the time that students definitely communicated in totally different ways that made them isolated in their rooms. And so one of the major lessons we learned was the residence life community needed to get students out of their dorm rooms and interacting with each other, because it was sort of on the cusp of students really using social media rather than having face-to-face conversations. So that was a major difference. Now, Liz, in many situations when I've looked into a particular crisis at a university across the country, I've noticed that I often find web pages that are dedicated to the issue. And I think Harvard recently has a web page dedicated to the affirmative action case that's going before the Supreme Court. Do you give advice on developing web pages in that kind of circumstance?
Definitely. I think particularly when you have an issue that is, that garners a lot of attention, that is sort of mission critical to the university, or that has a long time frame, a long horizon, where you do believe that there will be an opportunity to share updates. A lot of institutions have done this around sort of their efforts to take a more deliberate approach around diversity, equity, and inclusion, for example. So I think it's a really important way. It also allows you to have a dedicated place where people who are most interested, back to the sort of differentiation of audiences and stakeholders, people who are most interested can have those resources and information available to them, but you don't have to make it part of all of your communications. You don't have to put it sort of front and center for everyone. There are times when you might need to, but over time, people will say, I'm done hearing about that. I understand. I can access more information if I want to. So I think that's really important. It's also sort of a related piece to that, Monica, is having a place where the institution can also sort of share information on an ongoing basis around a particular, even sort of high profile, maybe crisis, maybe not situations, like a president's blog, or just having that capacity to be able to say, we need to communicate something. We need to kind of make it more broadly accessible. We think it should be beyond the campus community. We don't want to shout it from the rooftops, but we also want to be open about it. And so having that kind of platform is something that we see used really effectively for issues big and small.
And especially when a situation ends up in litigation, because in these days, when something is e-filed in court, it gets to reporters right away. And so a lot of times, you know, I mean, I started practicing in the days when you never said anything about a case because, you know, you could get away with, it's in litigation, we have no comment, because it was only the hard copy newspaper that was involved. But now there is so much that should be addressed in social media that I think it is, some of these web pages I've looked at actually have a link to the court documents that the university has filed, which tell the story, which tell, you know, yes, a complaint got filed, but here's our motion to dismiss. And you don't have to have a spokesperson saying it. You just lead the reader to the litigation file right away. And that's often helpful. I just want to cover a couple of other things we learned as a result of Tyler's tragic death. And on a positive, Rutgers, in coordination with the family, developed the Tyler Clementi Center for the study of diversity and bullying at Rutgers. And there was a lot of interest, there still is a lot of interest in the issue. And in terms of what we learned internally, one example which actually stands in my mind is that Rutgers, because it's a state university, gets a lot of students from New Jersey. Majority of the students come from New Jersey. And the dorm room that Tyler lived in only had 40 students, and it was a freshman dormitory. And we realized afterwards that most of the students in the dormitory, I'd say over half, came from the same high school that Darun Ravi came from. So they had the option to choose a dorm, and many of them chose this small dorm. We're all going to live together. So there was almost it was an automatic clique of students who knew each other. And Tyler was not from the same part of New Jersey or the same high school. So Residence Life, what they did was they built a program that basically controlled the zip codes of where students were coming from. And, you know, you couldn't have more than a certain number or a certain percentage of students from the same high school in the dormitory. I mean, the other outreach we made, I mean, this was a situation, because it was so public, we invited the journalists in, and there was a major program put on by Anderson Cooper. And he asked us, could he come to campus and hold a town hall with students about LGBTQ bullying? And Rutgers said yes, and there was a really good program. The auditorium was filled with students, and it worked out very well in terms of you know, a terrible tragedy. Tyler's family was at that event with Anderson Cooper, and, you know, a terrible tragedy. We were able to make positive movement and moving forward in the area of bullying and in LGBTQ students on college campuses. So on the whole, it was a success. I just noticed there's a question. The slides will be made available after the program. So we will send those slides out to those of you who are registered. Right now, I'm going to turn it over to my partner, Krista Cook. Oh, I'm sorry, Sandra Casey. Sandra Casey is next. Sorry about that, Sandra.
No problem. Thank you, Monica. And I'm happy and so honored to be part of this dynamic program. So we're going to talk a little bit about student protests. Student protests are something that everybody is familiar with. And so let's dig in. Next slide, please. So campus protests take on many forms. The traditional protests where individuals congregate in one place. You know, there's heckling of this kind of speaker. There's also, you know, something new that we've just talked about, the social media posts that go viral. And there's petitions. Something we've seen in the past year or so are online petitions from those such as change.org. So let's look at a few examples of protest. Next slide, please. So here we have a private institution, Zen College. It's located in an area that has experienced severe weather over the past several years, with the increasing number of damaging events within the past 5 years. Many students of Zen College and their families have been hard hit by these catastrophic events, with a majority of them losing their homes and some even losing loved ones. So U.S. Representative Tony Brand is widely known for her views on climate change, which she believes does not exist, and has stated that the recent catastrophic natural disasters can be attributed to normal historic weather patterns. Zen College has invited Representative Brand to speak on a panel addressing climate change. The climate change panel consisted of 3 panel members, 2 of whom have warned of the dangers of climate change, and Representative Brand. Each panelist was given 15 minutes to introduce themselves and offer their position statements. Next slide, please. Representative Brand was second to be introduced, and when she began to speak, about half of the audience began shouting at her, berating her for her views, holding up signs. Some of them highlighted her campaign donations from the fossil fuel industry. You know, the heckling rose to such a deafening level that no one could hear her speak. She then left the stage, entered a room outside of the auditorium where she remained behind closed doors. About a dozen students followed her to that room, banging on the door, pleading to speak to her directly. 2 members of the campus safety left the auditorium to intervene, but the students would not leave. The remaining protesters in the auditorium would not quiet down. You know, so the whole event had to be canceled. The campus just said, we're done. And now the campus is deciding whether to charge the students disrupting the event with disciplinary violations. Next slide, please. So keeping with the climate theme, across town from Zen College is Pleasant University, a public institution. Students, faculty, and some alum are pushing Pleasant University and the state to increase efforts to reduce their carbon footprint and cut ties with all businesses they believe are major contributors to the climate crisis. This group of individuals sent a petition to the Board of Trustees and president of the university with a list of demands. The students of this group have set up tents in the open areas of the campus, and a subset of students have demanded a meeting with the president. Some of the tents are even blocking the pathways to buildings. After receiving the list of demands, the president sends a message to the community, but was weighing her options on whether to meet with the students when about 20 of them stormed her office and refused to leave. Next slide, please. So with that fact pattern in mind, those fact patterns in mind, let's look at the governing law. So public universities are arms of their state governments and must ensure their actions comply with the First Amendment, which, as you know, afford great protection to free speech. Private institutions, on the other hand, typically offer First Amendment-like protections in their policies. Therefore, failure to follow those policies could give rise to a breach of contract claim. So, and also campuses must look to state law for guidance. You know, does the state constitution offer protection of speech on private property? And then there's states like California that has the Leonard Law, which prohibits the disciplining of students for conduct that would be protected under First Amendment. Next slide, please. But not all speech is protected. Unprotected speech include things like obscenity, true threats, fighting words, incitement to imminent lawless action, solicitation to commit crimes. And hate speech is protected if it does not fall in one of those exceptions. So, but courts allow reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. So there is some ability to navigate the speech. Next slide, please. And here's another piece of governing law, probably not, it's something that's not familiar to a lot of people. This is in the Higher Education Act. It is an aspirational law. It encourages basically all campuses, whether public or private, to allow protections of free speech. There's currently, though, no private right of action under this statute. However, we do need to be mindful of this statute because it is on the books, and there's actually proposed legislation to give it some teeth and to allow for a private right of action. Next slide, please. So just some thoughts to consider when looking at these fact patterns. For Representative Tony Brand's speech, campus planning is key. I always say, expect the worst and work from there. Work with campus council on governing law. It's very nuanced, as you can see from those prior slides. Ensure all respective departments know the rules and have a plan of implementation. Running through a tabletop exercise of a high-profile event where you bring in a high-profile figure such as a politician, a representative, a U.S. representative, a state senator, bringing people together and running through the tabletop exercises before the event is really helpful. And then remind the community of the academic mission. An academic institution is a marketplace of ideas is most effective when all points of views can be expressed in a respectful environment. This is how we all learn. Working with campus culture and values is also very important. And whatever action the institution takes, we have to ensure that it's content neutral. If students are to be disciplined, ask, would the students be disciplined for similar behavior unrelated to an expression of a position? Next slide, please. So for the protest at Pleasant University, visible areas could be designated to allow students to set up tents without disrupting campus activities and blocking access. Those time, place, and manner restrictions, really important here. So, but designated areas that, are hidden from the community, way, way far away, no one sees them tucked away, those kinds of designated areas are going to get strict scrutiny from a court. And then we have to consider presidential messaging. As Liz had talked about, is it possible to host a town hall meeting immediately after receiving a list of demands? This would offer students an opportunity to publicly air their grievance in a face-to-face meeting with the president and campus leadership. So, and also we have to be mindful of our policies again, content neutral policies regarding posting of banners or visiting the president's office. Again, time, place, and manner type restrictions. They should be clearly articulated. And like the preparation before Representative Brand's speech, once there was a demand to speak with the president, that's the time the crisis management team should, get together and begin planning for possibly a sit-in at the president's office. We've seen that happen. And in accordance with campus policy, ask yourself, will the students be allowed in? Will they be allowed to stay? Can they stay for a specified period of time? Or, will the president and the campus leadership, will they decide, well, they can stay indefinitely, whatever's practical, for your campus. And that's always key. So I leave you with these thoughts as you look at possible situations on your campus as they come up. We've stated, these crises, they come up quickly. And there's just seems like you can't act fast enough when they hit your campus. And I turn it over to my colleagues, Liz or Sarah, if you have any thoughts on what I've just expressed, please let me know.
I would just add that I think the point you made, Sandra, about tabletop exercises is really part of what you could do in terms of planning and having a specific plan. I'm thinking of an example of a large university in the Southeastern Athletic Conference that basically gave up its football stadium, which is a treasured property, for protest and sort of celebration around a controversial speaker as a way of really channeling and acknowledging that there would be people who wanted to have a response, and you know, they didn't sort of hide it in a corner of campus. Like the football stadium is, you know, the place that everybody wants to be. So just a thought in terms of also, you know, thinking about how this is likely to bring other commenters, you know, get to that sort of place of public debate and become an issue that is sort of reaching far outside of your campus.
Yeah, and also too, I would say, don't forget about students who could also help you vet certain crises. I mean, you know, they're the ones that are, you know, they're your audience and they're your main constituents, and their voice is often very, very helpful in planning. Thank you. And now I turn it over to Krista Cook.
Great. Thank you, Sandra. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. So I am going to talk briefly about sort of a different crisis in the context of Title IX, sexual misconduct. Certainly, if you could do the next slide, Kathy. Many people would agree that the first priority of any college or university, right, is to ensure the physical safety of your students and your campus community members. Right, that's first and foremost. So a sexual assault on campus poses undoubtedly a significant risk for a crisis level management response, or a need for that response. And some of the most widely publicized, you know, collegiate scandals have centered on sexual assault cases. Sort of echoing what some of my colleagues have said, right? The crisis management is very situational, right? Depends on a lot of factors. And it depends in part on who is impacted, right? The quote unquote human losses or impacts. And certainly the accused or the accuser, you know, the complainant or the respondent is certainly one of the two individuals who might be directly impacted. But colleges in these circumstances have to cater messaging to a much broader audience as well, right? We have faculty, we have staff, we have alumni, the general student population, parents, prospective students, parents of prospective students who might have concerns about the safety of their child on a campus in which these types of incidents have happened, your board of directors, if we've talked about, advocacy groups play oftentimes a significant part in these Title IX type situations, both on campus and off campus. Your donors, federal government entities, state government entities, and definitely media outlets. And each of these groups have a different needs and different interests, some of which are conflicting in a Title IX situation. Now, the message, as we've talked about, my colleagues have talked about, the message to stakeholders during a crisis, tell stakeholders sort of what to do, maybe in this type of a situation, what to do to protect themselves, how to help cope with the particular crisis in a Title IX situation. It might convey what happened. It might convey what the institution plans to do or how they intend to address the situation. And if there is a rape on campus, you will not be able to engage with all of those stakeholders, and certainly not in the same way. So we have to kind of think through those things as we've talked about throughout this program. Next slide. One of the other things that I just want to point out sort of at the outset when we're talking about a Title IX situation on your campus is, right, some crisis situations, like take a natural disaster, Hurricane Katrina or something like that. That is very different, right? The situations differ with regard to how much perceived control the institution has over any crisis. So in a natural disaster is happening to everyone. It's happening to the college itself. The college itself is the victim of that crisis and is perceived as having little to no control over at least the cause of, the natural disaster. Whereas sexual assault on a campus, is very different. Unlike a hurricane or a natural disaster, it will likely be deemed as a preventable crisis situation. And not surprisingly, the greater perceived responsibility or control the institution is viewed as having, the more accommodating the response strategy might need to be. So when dealing with claims of sexual violence or all of these types of potential reactions that we've highlighted here, right? You're plagued with shame and guilt, and blame and accountability and fear on your campus. We also need to be, as a result of that, the institution needs to avoid making any snap judgments, know what you don't know, as we had talked about earlier. But all of this makes controlling the message, right? We've talked about a united front and trying to control a message. It makes that uniquely different in a Title IX crisis situation. Next slide, Kathy. So there are going to be certainly some of you that are very attuned to Title IX law, but I want to give you a background because it impacts sort of the crisis response. So the legal backdrop, right? There are two categories that exist in this context: preventative and responsive. The Clery Act and Title IX regulations, I guess some would say, are aimed at combating the belief initially that rape victims were being silenced, right, to protect universities' reputations. Under the Clery Act, colleges and universities have to track crimes on campuses, including sexual assaults. They have to report data publicly. They have to publish safety policies. And crisis communications in connection with the Clery Act could be a whole separate topic of crisis communications. I'm not going to get that deep into it, but it does, it triggers a lot of issues about sort of collaboration and transparency, or the lack of transparency, avoiding, potentially racist or stereotypical descriptions in your timely warnings, all of that. But I want to focus on Title IX, which is a gender-based discrimination federal law. But it also covers, protects students against sexual assault and sexual harassment on campus. From a legal standpoint, and again, legal does not drive everything, as Phil had initially had noted, but it also drives our potential response, because an educational institution, right, is liable under Title IX if for sexual harassment or a sexual assault, if the school had knowledge of the misconduct and acted with deliberate indifference in failing to end that sexual violence. So it really just boils down to who knew what and what did the institution do in response. Those are key concepts, right, when you're looking at Title IX. There can be significant implications legally for Title IX, the loss of federal funding, which again is very rare. But students can often face expulsion, employees risk termination. And we have to, our crisis communications have to fall in line with the Title IX regulations. And if anybody worked closely with Title IX, you'll know that the mandates have swung back and forth, right? They have changed most recently, and which has framed our response, right? And our obligations as an institution. And I would just say one of the things that colleges can do to reduce the chances of a situation escalating to a crisis level in this context is to be vocal and transparent about your process, about your Title IX process. What do the students' rights? What are the students' rights on campus? How will the institution apply its policies? Where can those policies be found? Who enforces those policies? Who can you talk to about those policies? Emphasizing that the fact that a complainant, a victim has the autonomy under the policy to file a complaint or not to file a complaint. Emphasizing, our process allows both sides to submit evidence. All of that goes to educating your campus community. So next slide. So if you're not exhausted from the concept of social media, just a few comments here, because, right, despite the fact that, we've said so much about it, social media platforms, right, have been criticized as hostile, full of potentially misinformation, deeply polarized. I myself use it at least on some level, and students most certainly do, right? With regard to sexual assaults in the higher education sector, audiences are digesting media historically tended to take away the notion that college administration is letting sexual assault run rampant on college campuses, right? That was the frame, sort of, from a media perspective. More recently, the frame, in conjunction with the changes in the laws, has maybe been that, that the accused of those accused of sexual assault were being treated unfairly by institutions and were being deprived of due process rights. So we've had this pendulum of a sort of a media frame. But there's no escaping that news will spread fast and quickly, and no institution's Title IX process is immune to this type of a scandal. We've seen it be a very significant player. It's used both in support of victims' claims and in the defense of the accused. And again, because it is real time, that impacts our ability to sort of respond. Phil, I wanted to sort of turn it back to you on this piece of, because you touched on this earlier, you and Liz, about the correction of misstatements and engaging or not engaging in this Title IX context.
Yeah, so Krista, I mean, this issue of correction of misstatements, that's a challenge for an institution, no doubt, right? And we touched on this earlier. An institution, a college or university, operates within constraints that aren't binding on students, right? And so you can have students out there talking about the Title IX process, Title IX process, is it effective? Do students trust or have faith in the Title IX process? And we've seen this erupt on any number of campuses, but as an institution, when, for example, a student is out there talking about what they experienced through your Title IX process because of things like FERPA or Title IX, we're just going to be subject to some confidentiality obligations that are going to limit or at least inform what we can and can't say. But even within those parameters, I mean, I think your options may depend on the circumstances, or at least your choice may depend on the circumstances. So, for example, if you've got a student saying that they came forward and voiced a concern, and they were dissuaded from bringing a formal Title IX complaint, the old sweep it under the rug argument that we've seen before, that somehow they went in and talked to the Title IX coordinator, and the Title IX coordinator really painted a picture of the process that led them to walk away and not pursue any kind of a remedy. So yeah, I mean, as we talked about before, there may be ways to say something without talking about what happened to that particular student. We can talk about what our policies are and how we emphasize to anybody who comes in what their rights are, and they have a right to pursue a campus process. They have a right to pursue a law enforcement process. They can do both. They can do neither. And we ensure that everybody has their knowledge of their rights. We have resources on campus that can help people evaluate those rights and to support them, those sorts of things. And we can say those sorts of things in this context. But again, circumstances, context, optics matter, right? I mean, you might very well determine that when someone's talking about the traumatic experience they had, that meeting them head on with a rebuttal, might not play as well as you want it to, right? I mean, that's a discretionary call on the part of the institution. If there's litigation, maybe as Monica noted before, maybe the no comment on pending litigation on something like this, instead of being, frustrating, might be your dodge on a question, for lack of a better description. Or you might choose to just talk, about your values as an institution, maybe not your policies, maybe not your processes, even separated from what this particular student experienced, but maybe you talk about as an institution what your values are and how we abhor sexual violence. And it is core to our mission to ensure that we eradicate sexual violence on our campus, and we support that more broadly, more societally as well, and talk about it on that level. But I think, correcting a misstatement, challenging for any number of reasons, some of them legal, some just the optics of, who's on the other side of this conversation, and do you want to take a full swing here, or do you want to do something that's a little more, for lack of a better word, sensitive or discretionary in terms of how you respond. And I think somebody said it earlier, this is all so situational, and I think the circumstances matter.
Absolutely. Thanks, Phil. One of the other things we note here about, dealing with the social media and whether you respond and how you respond is, certainly Title IX in these situations are going to generate very strong responses from very active constituencies. And whether that is, your students as particular advocacy group, whether it's an internal or an external, you need to be paying attention, sort of give some thought to what is the particular situation? How is it snowballing? Why is it snowballing? We don't want it to get to a crisis level. And from the outset, we've kind of started this, right? A crisis is not simply a bad experience, right? It is a critical instance with elements of surprise and threats and short response time. All of that makes up a crisis. It's more than an emergency, because as most Title IX coordinators that I work with on a daily basis would say, every Title IX situation seems to be an emergency, right? And we want to take it seriously. We always take it seriously. When has an emergency that we take seriously sort of escalated into that crisis mode or potential crisis mode, and then sort of focusing on who is that priority audience. If you go to the next slide, Kathy. So we've created, much like Sandra had done, and created some sort of hypothetical scenarios based on situations that we see reoccur both here within our offices and in the news, right? These types of situations are unfortunately all over the news. And hopefully these will help, you can ask yourself, how would our college or how would our university handle this type of situation, right? You've heard in the beginning, Liz and Sarah and Phil give you all this great advice about the need for preparation, right? And hopefully you're going to go back and you're going to talk about, well, we got to either create a crisis management plan, or we want to revise it. And thinking through some of these scenarios that Sandra and I and Candace are giving you, sort of trigger that, hopefully will trigger that and aid in that process. So you have multiple female students accuse a high-profile football player at the institution of sexual assault. Those reports never reached the Title IX coordinator, handled within the athletics department. The football player continues to play the remainder of the season, and the football player is later arrested for sexual assault of one of those students that attends your institution. Story then blows up within the national media, local national media, the football player is ultimately convicted of rape. Students create social media sites in which further rape allegations are made by others against other student athletes. The institution responds on its social media site. Students post claims of rape and inaction by the college on that site. And the institution deletes those posts because of those allegations and directs the students, please don't post those allegations on social media. The appropriate way to that we can handle this is please come to the Title IX office, and we encourage you to make a complaint. That, of course, generates more media coverage, more visibility. The politicians, your local politicians, the media, and the student body, which is now organized to protest on campus and is calling for the resignation of the football coach and the college president. As I mentioned earlier, right, collegiate scandals involving sexual assault are unfortunately in the news more than we'd like to see, and oftentimes involve the institution's athletics department, right? Athletics-based scandals tend to attract the most attention. That's, just the reality of the situation. And these types of fact patterns, right, draw a lot of visibility and a lot of news coverage. So a few issues, right, can jump out to you right away. One of the issues, right, is the presence of social media in the university's decision to respond via its own social media. Its decision to remove those posts and encouraging students to file with the Title IX coordinator. Now, technically, right, we have policies that encourage students to bring forth complaints of sexual assault to the university. So technically that's right, may not necessarily be the right response in the way it was carried out here. One of the other things that this sort of hypothetical raises is this issue of the student body, the parents, politicians, media, really and donors demanding the resignation of your president, other administrators, those types of situations. Liz, have you worked with other higher education institutions or clients about those types of demands and situations, and kind of give us some thoughts on that?
Unfortunately, yes. And I think, this is more common than any of us would like. But I think there certainly are ways that you, as Phil talked about before, you want to really lean very heavily on both inviting people to participate in the established process. The institution wants to show as much sensitivity and awareness about what's going on, and needs to, I think, start to engage directly with the student body, whether that's the dean of students or a collection of administrators. But there needs to be some activity there. I think, there's as each person is brought into this situation, the football coach, the college president, I think the football coach in particular probably has a role to play, given the importance of sort of maintaining both the trust of the team, but also showing that football players are held to the same standards and have the same expectations for behavior as everyone else on campus. And so being really clear about that. In this situation, I would really try to avoid involving the college president. I think that's just, again, a ploy to try to sort of feed the fire. But realistically, this is about an incident, involving certainly one student, clearly, who was convicted, potentially other issues. So whatever investigations kind of need to happen, whatever information is provided through the Title IX process, I think, again, the institution being really clear and communicating what it can, when it can, about the fact that it's doing everything possible to pursue these issues and to address students' concerns. And if there are things that they need to do, add more patrols, add a higher level of campus safety officers, et cetera, add, lights on campus. So whatever, add call boxes, emergency call boxes. So all of those activities, I think, are showing that you're really taking concrete steps in addition to how you try to navigate this from a communication standpoint.
Great. Next slide, Kathy. So I wanted to give you just one more sort of hypothetical fact pattern in a Title IX context, right? And so a revered faculty member is accused of sexually harassing several students, is ultimately disciplined by the institution as a result of those complaints. Many members of the faculty population who learn of the allegations through word of mouth and the media are filled with skepticism, concerns, right? They're bothered by the confidential nature of the institutional process itself because they don't really know in depth what happened. A number of the faculty published letters of support for the colleague denouncing the allegations, painting the accused as a victim and criticizing the sanctions against their esteemed colleague. Multiple students then bring a Title IX cause of action against the college. The vocal faculty now, with this pending litigation, claim they had misguided opinions about their colleague and attempt to retract the letters of support. So now, in addition to defending a Title IX lawsuit, the institution is now forced to deal with nationwide media coverage potentially, and the faculty-student relationship on campus is certainly tainted with a significant amount of mistrust. Again, part of the struggle here is the expectation and/or regulatory mandates of confidentiality, in the sense that they formed opinions about this very significant situation based either on one person's side of the story or based on news stories, which certainly are not going to be tell every fact of the pattern, right? These situations, administrations can certainly try to explain that, for example, to the faculty, that they may very well not know the whole story. They may very well not know what all of the allegations were or why the institution reached the decision that they did. And another thing that comes often in Title IX context is about timing. So in this hypothetical, the investigation had been completed, the accused was sanctioned. Oftentimes, these Title IX crises blow up before almost immediately when the college is being informed of the allegations. So they haven't had the opportunity to investigate. They don't know much about, right, what's going on. So there's like three options. They can do nothing, sort of the ostrich effect, because we don't know what we don't know, and so we're just not going to do anything. The college can take an extreme response and fully back the claims of the complainant. That poses its own dangers because the person that's accused might be innocent. And the third option, which it's very situational, but the third option is to turn the crisis into a platform, right, for meaningful change and discussion, not speaking directly to that case or to that, a particular sexual assault complaint, but addressing the issue of Title IX sexual assault on campus, sort of on a macro level. Liz, could you just share your thoughts quickly about sort of how would you advise an institution in this type of a situation to sort of unring the bell here?
I do think that there's sort of the immediate communications response, which in part is going to depend on which path they have, chosen and what path they need to take. But I think which is if you're early in the process or haven't undergone the investigation yet, you have to be clear about that. It may make sense for the faculty member to be on leave because it can be very challenging to have sort of an active presence, you know, really for all participants, including students. But again, you may have policies around that. So just thinking about how you need to navigate that to have what feels like a fair, consistent process. And also, I think this does represent an opportunity. Clearly, there's a need for some education and further dialogue among the campus, you know, all members of the campus about how we like what the responsibility we have individually and collectively in allowing our processes to sort of advance appropriately and in not sort of rushing to judgment. Social media is a catalyst for that. And we did have a question from one of our participants in the audience around that I think is relevant here around what would you do relative to someone posting information about a student or faculty member on their own social media platforms, or you know, from their own handles. Should the institution respond? And I'd say largely probably not. Even in the example that you gave previously, you know, they responded on their own platform, because to start to participate in someone else's dialogue, unless it's someone who has a tremendous amount of following and influence that you really feel like you have to address, even then, all you're doing is you're basically giving that person you know, further attention, and you're really saying, you know, validating that that post and that participant in this issue, which is someone, you know, if it's someone outside of this institution, that's not really a path you want to take. So I think it's how do you make sure that you're having the conversations, providing the information in the forums where you have the most control, even though there's very little control overall.
Great advice, Liz. Thank you. Next slide. We've talked a little bit about this, but, you know, misunderstandings are certainly, you know, what lead to discontent and controversy. And Title IX imposes legal requirements, and certainly in the area of confidentiality, that shape the institution's response, you know, to any sexual assault case, and certainly a high-profile case. What we just want to bring to your attention here is to think about that, you know, the confidentiality mandates can be an issue both on the front end and sort of once you've reached a crisis level situation, and how you respond to that. It certainly could exacerbate the crisis. So need to think about give some thought to, you know, are there ways to keep the campus community informed while still sort of staying within the bounds of your confidentiality obligations and your legal, you know, obligations. The next slide. And we've talked about sort of your team, right? And you're going to have a Title IX crisis team. Not every member of that Title IX crisis team is going to be called upon in every situation. There's some characteristics that you're going to want to have from that team, both, you know, when they're doing internal communications and when they're doing, you know, communicating on an external level. Being timely on both is certainly one of them. From an institutional knowledge perspective, you're going to want to think ahead, you know, who are your team players and what are their particular roles in this type of a situation? You know, what, if any, role is the Title IX coordinator? Certainly that Title IX coordinator is going to be key to, you know, sort of assessing the situation, but may not be your spokesperson. You know, what role does the college president play? You oftentimes are going to get constituencies such as bias response teams or student advocacy groups that are going to have a lot of opinions or going to want to sort of voice their position, or, you know, what they think that the institution should be conveying. So sort of defining that role the best you can ahead of time is beneficial, because, as you know, my colleagues and Liz have said, you know, time is of the essence. You don't have a lot of time to sort of get those folks together and tell people who shouldn't be talking not to talk, and those who are talking or should be talking, and making sure they're equipped to do that, that they feel comfortable doing that, that they know that is the role and responsibility. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Candace.
Great. Thank you so much, Krista. And I just want to say congratulations to all of the attendees. And I'm congratulating you because it's Wednesday. Happy Wednesday. You made it through more than half of your work week. I appreciate you hanging in there with me for the closing out of this presentation. I'm going to try to keep it lively because I know that you've probably been putting in a lot of work today and already this week, and we're just going to try to add to the great information that my colleagues have already shared with you. So thank you so much for joining us. Kathy, if you don't mind, why don't we move into the next slide, please? So we're going to talk about racial discrimination and how to handle a situation that may come up regarding a racial discrimination scandal, as we call it. Here's a fact pattern that is a hypothetical, but not so hypothetical, because of course it is based on real circumstances combined from a few different situations that we've either personally dealt with or that have been in the news. So as inflammatory as some of the information may be, it is not impossible. Let's put it that way. These things have occurred and hopefully they don't occur again, but chances are they will. So let's talk through how they have been handled and how they can be handled possibly better in the future. So we have a highly regarded university that hosted a theatrical play to display performances by graduate level students in the Masters in Fine Arts or MFA program. The play featured several rising stars who were on their way to Broadway and the movies. Several media outlets were invited to cover the event, and important guests and alumni were also invited. On the night of the big debut, as the play was being performed, some audience members became uncomfortable because they perceived the actors' makeup and accessories to be racist. Next slide, please. Some of the actors wore exaggerated large red prosthetic lips, and their skin was dramatically darkened with makeup. Some of the actors also wore large prosthetic ears that were akin to monkey ears. Next slide, please. The public backlash to this performance was swift and it was harsh. Some university students publicly expressed that this theatrical performance reflected a pattern of more widespread racist practices at the university, and these students were understandably hurt and angry. The NAACP held a press conference denouncing the university and demanding accountability. Television reporters and newspaper journalists descended on the campus. So everyone is looking for the story at this point. Next slide, please. So of course, what do we have? We have the finger pointing that starts, as with almost any crisis involving individuals, unless you're talking about a natural disaster or something completely beyond the control of humans, there's probably going to be finger pointing at some point in your crisis. And here we see that current faculty members and administrators were pointing fingers at each other regarding who was responsible for allowing the allegedly racist accessories and blackface makeup to be displayed. Alumni were very upset that the school's reputation was being tarnished by a wave of negative publicity, both on the local level and the national level. And of course, we have wealthy donors that are now holding off on making contributions until they can see that the university has demonstrated that they've handled their problems. So they're holding on to their money until they are able to sort out what type of reaction the university is having to the situation. Next slide, please. So hindsight is 2020. When we look back at a situation, often solutions come to mind that may not have been immediately obvious to us. So here, let's look at what could have been done differently. Number one, obtaining feedback from diverse individuals is often very important because it helps us to recognize blind spots. In this situation, this scandal may have been avoided by appointing a committee on diversity practices that was focused upon ethical standards and practices in the arts specifically, because we know that a situation regarding the arts can be different, and we're going to talk more about how that can play out differently. And this committee would have been able to provide the decision makers in the MFA program with feedback regarding the play before it was publicly debuted. In this situation, the only individuals responsible for reviewing the accessories and makeup before the performance were white males who did not seem to recognize or anticipate the ways in which the accessories and makeup could be perceived by persons in different racial groups. And I think that's important for all of us to understand that we all have blind spots. None of us is going to be completely aware of all of the cultural nuances of every different racial or ethnic group. And that's why it's so important to have different voices in the room, because something may seem completely neutral to me and not at all be offensive, whereas one of my colleagues from a different walk of life, a different background, may feel entirely different about it based on their cultural experience and their history. And without having that other viewpoint, we could miss a lot of things. And that's why the lack of diversity sometimes can really be a risk. And I know we don't think about the existence of diversity as being a risk management tool, and certainly we shouldn't have it for that purpose, but in some ways it is, because a lot of risky situations could have been avoided if we had had a more diverse outlook to begin with. So, there's a lot of reasons why diversity is important, but one reason is that it's not just a touchy-feely, it's meant to be nice type of thing. It can also be really helpful in making sure your university stays out of hot water that could be avoided by having different perspectives. Here we also know that none of the students or tenured faculty members, and I want to emphasize tenured faculty members in the MFA program, were African American. Therefore, the university had certain blind spots that it may not have fully contemplated prior to the scandal caused by the performance. And we'll move on to the next slide, and I'm going to explain more about why I highlighted the word tenured, because I think we've got to recognize that everyone does not have an equal ability to speak up without consequences. The MFA program had one African American adjunct professor who was hoping to become tenure tracked. The adjunct professor believed that challenging the decisions of senior level tenured faculty members and administrators would have foreclosed her future employment opportunities. And I just want us to think about that, because a lot of times universities say, okay, diversity, I got it, great, let's get a person of this cultural background and a person of that cultural background and someone from that religion, let's put them all in the room and we're going to have a great outcome because now we have the melting pot we're looking for. But if all of those individuals don't have the ability to speak freely without consequence, then having them in the room is really going to be very ineffective, because at the end of the day, especially when we're talking about employment situations, all of these individuals are worried about whether they're going to have health insurance for their families, whether they're going to continue to be employed, whether they're going to stick around long enough to get retirement and pensions. And sometimes those considerations may outweigh whatever concerns they have about your fashion show or your article or your sporting event or whatever the particular issue is at that time, because they have the normal human concerns that we all have and the self-preservation instinct that we all have in terms of our employment and even our status on campus when it comes to students. So when we put all of those different people in a room, we've got to make sure that they feel empowered to actually speak up when they see things that are concerning. Next slide, please. The importance of context. We know that during the investigation of the incident, the costume designer, who also selected the accessories and the makeup, noted that he has always been fascinated with finding beauty in features that may be typically shunned by the mainstream narrative. And the costume designer said that he selected the accessories and the makeup with the goal of highlighting the beauty in certain features. And in fact, he had a portfolio dating back several years, long before the show, that displayed his work regarding that concept. He had a whole thesis, a whole portfolio of work that centered around that concept. But without the context of this artistic viewpoint, the audience was left without the ability to analyze his artistic viewpoint. So it's very difficult often to provide context when we're talking about art. What are some ways that it possibly can be done? Perhaps the lead up to the play and the advertising materials and the Twitter posts and all of those things Maybe there could be a teaser in there. Maybe there's a video from the costume designer talking about his portfolio of work and why he went about designing the play in this type of way. Maybe there's a caption in the booklet that is the play program explaining the artistic perspective. Maybe there's some type of verbal information that is given at the beginning of the play, just to kind of frame it in a way that people still may be upset with. Having that type of disclaimer, so to speak, is not going to mean that everyone is pleased with it. It's not a, get out of jail free card, but it may possibly allow for the context to have more of a discussion instead of the immediate outrage that sometimes we see in these situations. Next slide, please. And as with anything, even with the great solutions, there are complications. One complication could be time. It's going to take time to form committees and to get the right people in a room. And that's going to have to be something that is made a priority. Resources. Whether or not you have diverse individuals to draw from who can even voice their opinions without the fear of repercussion, that's going to be based on who you have on campus. So have you invested in the resources to make sure you have that pool of people to even draw from? That's something that has to happen long before any particular performance or any type of situation. Do you have the right people available that you can even call upon? And money may be a consideration when it comes to resources, because the individuals that you may need to get expert opinions or educated opinions from may require some type of compensation. And that is not kind of unfamiliar. If we think about it in the context of a faculty member who is selected to chair a thesis or a dissertation committee, they're often financially compensated. And I don't think many of us kind of even think twice about that, because we see the value that they're bringing in that role. When it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, there are times when people may overlook the value that that is bringing, and they may not even immediately think that some type of compensation may even be worthy of consideration. And we have to make sure that we're investing the financial resources into the things that we believe are important. And if we really believe that DEI is important, then we have to, as they say, put our money where our mouth is. Potential for limiting artistic expression. That's something that is not easy to parse out because we know that artistic expression, it often is difficult to categorize. How do we define what is obscene? How do we define what is racist? That's not always very clear. So that can be very hindering to an artist. And on the flip side, there's the potential for perpetuating negative stereotypes simply for the sake of art. Are we letting people get away with certain artistic themes or messages simply cloaked in the kind of excuse that it's artistic, where there are really more, malevolent instincts or motivations behind it? And there are potential legal concerns, of course. If we don't address a situation that is potentially racially discriminatory, there could be a claim from an employee that we are allowing this hostile work environment to basically exist because we're not properly addressing racial discrimination. There could be a student OCR claim. The Office for Civil Rights takes claims pretty much from just about anyone. You don't necessarily have to be the victim of discrimination to file a complaint with OCR. And of course, there are First Amendment claims. The First Amendment claims, they could run the gamut and be very interesting. I'm thinking of a case in 2019 where a graduate level student used a noose in his artwork. And this picture of the noose became very disturbing to many people. He explained that his reason for putting it in there was that there was no inherent meaning in an object. And he was trying to show that an object is just an object until we bring our own meaning or perspective to it. And he was prohibited from showing it in certain settings. The Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, also known as FIRE, became involved, and they argued it based on First Amendment grounds. Unfortunately, many of our colleges and universities are very familiar with FIRE because they step in whenever there's even a hint of a First Amendment claim. So, these are all considerations. Next slide, please. And after the storm, cleaning up the wreckage, we know that university town hall discussions were held to allow students and faculty to express their views. I'm going to finish out the rest of this slide, but I just want to kind of give Monica time to think about this question that I'm hoping we can come back to. Town hall discussions can be very great and they can be very useful, and they could also get out of control very quickly. So Monica, if you could give us your thoughts on how universities can run effective town hall discussions that kind of stay on track as opposed to being kind of a train wreck, that would be great. So I'm just going to run through the final points and then we'll come back to Monica. In the wake of a scandal, after a comprehensive investigation by an outside investigator, a faculty member and administrator in the MFA program were fired. The university required each MFA student to take a course in arts and ethics, which is, becoming more and more popular because we're seeing that there are a lot of different ethical considerations in many different artistic forums that we should be aware of and we should be educating our students about. A diverse committee was appointed to screen performances and provide feedback. And I put screen in quotes because that doesn't necessarily mean that this committee decides what is going to be released to the public and what is not. They may simply be there just in the capacity of offering feedback, but they don't have the final say, perhaps. So, the way it's structured at your school may be different, but it's something for you to think about. And the university established scholarships for students of color. So circling back to the town hall discussions, Monica, can you give us some thoughts on that?
Sure. And I want to invite everybody else to add to it, but I do, this reminds me of going back a ways in my career where one of the vice president at the institution where I was working invited me to come with him to meet a constituent group in the midst of a crisis. And I had thought that he was going to be doing the talking. So I had given him talking points, but I directed him not to talk about the OCR complaint that was filed. And we got to the event and the VP essentially did a wind up and said, Monica's here to present about the OCR complaint. And so it was a situation where I had to, accept the challenge, and I was able to describe what the complaint was about and what we had already submitted to OCR. I was careful not to talk about confidential issues, but it was one of those things where I started talking. There were questions that I couldn't answer from the audience because of confidentiality concerns. But it was a situation where it got very heated. But I think because I was there with the VP, he was able to control the students. He was the VP for Student Affairs. He let them speak. He started addressing the responses. I think it overall went well. The administration took a couple of hits, but I think the students appreciated the fact that we showed up. That doesn't give very good tips on how to handle the situation. I'll ask Liz or Phil or Sarah or Krista if you have any comments.
I would just quickly add, I would hold it as soon as possible, because rather than allowing people to form the opinion that the institution isn't concerned about this, I think providing that forum quickly is critical. I think also not time bounding that forum is also essential, basically saying, I will be here as long as people have things to say, because it is a very important posture to maintain. We're here to listen. We're here to hear you. You are not to be using that forum as problem solving or reporting back necessarily. It's really an opportunity primarily for people to vent. And if you do have information to convey, to do that, but mostly it's for people to vent.
Yeah, I think that's really good, Liz, in terms of you don't want to be the first person to walk out of a crowded room when you're doing a town hall like that. Back to you, Candace.
Great. That was really good advice. Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Liz. And I just want to thank all of my colleagues. I know that we are at the 5 o'clock mark, so I don't want to go over my time anymore. Sarah, I will turn it back to you in terms of the conclusion of the program.
Great. Thank you, Candace, and thank you, everyone. Thank you to all the attendees for tuning in. And I know some people have expressed interest in the slides. You will receive access to copies following this presentation, and we hope you found it useful. Thank you so much.